Welcome back to Computer Auditing Advanced, Part 2. This is Part 2 in the second part of a series called Computer Auditing. In Part 1 of Computer Auditing, we had 3 videos in which we went through general controls. In this part of the series, which is called Computer Auditing Advanced, we have 2 videos in which we go through application controls. If you have not watched any videos yet in the series, I will strongly encourage you to go back to the first videos and watch them before coming to this one. This is the last video in this series. We are going to be continuing on from Computer Auditing Advanced Part 1, which is where we introduce the idea of program checks. We're going to be digging deeper into program checks. Let's look at what we're going to be doing today. Application controls, Part 2, the agenda. First is we want to go in depth into program checks and understand what program checks are and when can they be implemented. We then want to finish off with CATs, Computer Assisted Auditing Techniques. Let's get straight into program checks. So program checks, we say that there are 3 types of program checks. First, program checks that assist us in inputting information into the system. This is the type that we're going to focus on first. And when we talk about this type of program check, we want you to think about how do we enter information into our laptop? What can the laptop do to assist us in entering information? For example, validity check. If we are entering specific information into the system can then check back onto the master file to ensure that the information that we've entered is actually accurate. Match check. Match check is where the information you've entered is matched to some sort of other information on the database and not specifically the master file. Format check. Format check is where when you're entering in information into the system automatically checks the information that you've entered. For example, when you are entering an address, you want to have the name of the road, which cannot be a number. It has to be letters. And you also need to have the street number, and that has to be a number. So the system can be programmed in order to ensure that whatever is entered into street number is a number, and whatever is entered into street address or street name is a word. This is called an alphanumeric check. We can also have a size check. For example, your student number is 9 digits. Whenever you're entering your student number, the system should check that your student number is comprised of 9 digits and not less or more. Mandatory fields, as mentioned before, deals with when a specific field is required before moving on. And validity and sign checks is where if you're entering a minus or plus, the sign that you enter is the correct sign. Reasonability checks is where there's a specific limit to something. For example, you can only work 40 hours in a week. If you enter more than that hours worked in a week, the system will automatically reject that entry and say that that entry is wrong. So it's not reasonable for you to work more than 40 hours in a week. Data approval checks is where there's a preset condition for the data that's supposed to be entered. For example, a debtor that is 90 days in terms of credit terms cannot be given 120 days because 90 days is the credit term of the entity. Sequence checks, that is where you are entering multiple things at once and the system will not allow you to skip over given numbers or given sequences. For example, if you're entering different invoices, the system will not allow you to enter one invoice twice, and the system will not allow you to miss specific invoices. That is sequence checks. These are different types of checks that are put in place when someone is entering information into the system. Now let's move on to process checks. Process checks, very similar to input checks, might have similar tests. For example, sequence tests. When information is being processed by the computer can check that the sequence is continuous, that the sequence is reasonable, that the amounts entered are reasonable, and that the amounts entered match the specific data that is already entered into the system. We can also have accuracy of totals. So that means that the totals are correct. Let's go through a few detailed program checks for processing. For example, arithmetic accuracy means that it checks the maths that has been entered into the system. means that the numbers add up. Program reconciliation checks is where the entity reconciles information that has been entered to other things in the database. For example, echo checks. Echo checks is where a small signal is sent along a transmission line. This ensures that the transmission line is active and working and that the data on both sides is arriving accurately. Total checks. That's where control totals or count totals are compared to other information entered onto the system. Run-to-run totals. Run-to-run totals are when opening balances are compared to closing balances and the match between the opening and closing balances is ensured to be correct. Parity checks is when a small bit of data, now when we're dealing with data, we've got bytes, kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes. Now, when we are transferring data from one computer to the next, we transfer it by bytes. Parity tests is when the system actually adds a dummy or fake byte onto the data, either at the end or the beginning of the data. Then the data is transferred to the receiving computer. When the receiving computer receives the data, it picks up that there's a small dummy byte added to the end and a small dummy byte added to the beginning. It compares the two and then communicates back to the sending computer to tell the computer these are the dummy bytes that I have received. This ensures that all the bytes that were transferred have actually been transferred. Equipment test. Equipment test is where we test the hardware and the software that is used when we are operating the system. This is normally done before the system goes live, or before the system is used by the user. Now we're going to move on to output control. The purpose of output controls is to make sure that outputs are accurate, complete, and that they are distributed in the correct way. Outputs do not have to be hard copies. They can sometimes be on the screen. When we're dealing with output controls, we're going to be dealing with two broad topics. One is distribution and the next is the user. Let's look at distribution. What are some preventative controls to ensure that the distribution happens correctly? First, we want to make sure that the report is clearly labeled so that whoever is dealing with the report, whoever is dealing with the output knows exactly what the report is made up of, who it's meant to be going to, and what is the purpose of it. The next thing is we can have numbered pages and sequentially numbered pages. That means that if a page is missing, it is easily identified. The important thing about page numbering is to make sure that you have at the bottom of the page, page 1 of 10, so that you know that there's 10 pages in total. And that ensures that if page 9 is missing, it can easily be picked up. When we talk about processing period, it talks about the time that the data relates to. What is the time frame that the data is related to? When was the data processed? Who entered it, etc. A distribution matrix is when we are listing who needs to receive the data. So we indicate the privileges of the employees and the privileges that they have to the output. If you are dealing with a hard copy output, meaning like a report or a document that has been printed, we are then unable to make a distribution matrix. Remember, a distribution matrix is something that sits on the system and allows specific people to access the output. But if we're dealing with a hard copy, we then need to create a distribution list. Means it has the names of the people that need to see the report. Restricted access to printers. So with restricted access to printers, each person that uses a printer has their own unique username and password. You will know this when you are dealing with printers in the LAN. Each person that uses the printer has their own unique username and password. This ensures that only information that you want to print out, you are able to access. No one else is able to access your information. The other thing is that when we are printing outputs, we only print outputs to specific printers. The design of stationery. That means that the paper as well as the stationery used to complete an output is designed in such a way that ensures the completeness and validity of the output created. After documents have been used, and they've been used to make decisions, etc., they've been distributed accurately, each person that has received a copy needs to destroy them. Now that's when we're dealing with hard copies. When we're dealing with soft copies or screen printouts, then the system automatically can destroy unused copies. Let's move on to users. When we are talking about users, user controls are all detective. For example, the output that's given to the user needs to be complete. The user can check to ensure that all data that has been received is complete. That may mean counting the number of pages that they've received. They can reconcile the input data to the output data to ensure that the information that they put into the system and the information that came out is a true representation of what was put in. They can check for reasonability, and they can also review any exception reports. Exception reports are reports created by the system that details any errors that have occurred or any things that have gone wrong. Logging and reports. Logging, as mentioned before, is where we keep a record of who does what in what system. This creates an audit trail. An audit trail means that we are able to identify or isolate responsibilities for given people, and we are able to follow transactions and look at summaries. Run-to-run balancing reports are reports that provide evidence on how opening balances became closing balances. So what transactions have taken place in order to create the closing balance. Override reports list all times that the system controls were overrid, and more importantly, isolates the responsibility of who overrode the controls. Exception reports, as mentioned previously, has a list of activities or conditions that took place during processing. It can also indicate when there are errors that have taken place. Activity reports, on the other hand, list the activities that a given person has done. It is a very important part of logging. Often when we talk about logging, we are actually talking about the activity reports. Access and violation reports simply indicate who has accessed the software, and if there's any violation of access, it is also recorded. So if anyone has hacked the system, it is recorded. Master files. As indicated previously, a master file is a record of all data for a given topic. For example, debtors will have their own master file, and all the information relating to debtors will be contained on the master file. Now, every now and then, there is a change that needs to be made to the master file. We call these master file amendments. Master file amendments are when we change the master file directly, we may lose data or we may create inaccurate data. So it's critically important that master file amendments happened in a very controlled fashion. The first thing that we want to ensure is that any master files that are changed by use of source documents. So there's some supporting document that is around when making a change. The next thing is that there must be an official master file amendment form. This is a form, a manual form that is filled out by the person requiring to make the master file amendment. The form then needs to be approved by someone with the required authority. Generally, you'll find that the approval comprises of 2 people that are senior staff members that will sign off on the report. The report, when being reviewed, when the master file amendment form is being reviewed, it is generally cross-referenced to the supporting documentation that is contained with the master file amendment form. Entry only happens after the master file amendment has been approved. Once master file amendments have been approved, they are entered very carefully, and we use username to limit access. We use passwords, least privilege, as well as multiple program checks and screen aids in order to ensure that information entered into the master file is accurate. Master file amendments are then logged. So each and every change made to the master file is logged. When that change is logged, later on someone with the required authority will be reviewing the log and ensuring that the master file amendment has been made accurately, has been captured accurately. The required approval was obtained before entering into the system, and that the forms and supporting documents are contained in the master file amendment file. Computer-assisted auditing techniques. Computer-assisted auditing techniques is exactly what it says it is. It is the way of using a computer in order to assist us when we are doing our audit. Notice how the word assist is included in the acronym, meaning that a computer does not replace the auditor. Therefore, we are still required to do a lot of the work. The one benefit, though, of using computer-assisted auditing techniques is that a computer is able to deal with large amounts of data and makes very few to no errors. Currently, computers are so reliable that they can deal with what we call big data, which simply just means lots of volume of data. They're able to deal with big data and make no errors, whereas a human performing the same function would take extremely long and will make multiple errors in processing the data. So computers give us that edge. We can look at large amounts of data and make very few errors. How do computers fit into the audit strategy? Whenever we are talking about our audit strategy and audit plan, we have to mention CATs, or computer-assisted auditing techniques, because there is no company that exists today that does not use a computer and does not have their financial records contained on a computer. So as auditors, we are required to be comfortable with using computers in performing our audit. Now, when we are using computer-assisted auditing techniques, we are using specific software, but more importantly, we want to look at things like spreadsheets and word processes that help us to review information and look at large amounts of data. We can also have very specialized CATs which are made particularly for a given company to identify patterns or identify trends, and that gives us better audit information. There are three types of computer-assisted auditing techniques. Now notice these are just techniques. They are not actual software. So the first part of computer-assisted auditing techniques is auditing around the computer. This is a very primitive way of using computer-assisted auditing techniques. This is because we treat the computer and the processing that the computer does as something that is unknown. Basically, we test the inputs that has gone into the computer and we separately test the outputs that come out, which means we don't look at what processing has happened in between. Basically, what the job of the computer is, we don't look at. This is why we say that auditing around the computer is treating the computer as a black box. So we look at the supporting documentation, which is shown here in orange, and we ensure that that goes into the computer, but then we don't know what happens in the computer. That's why we treat the computer as a black box. The computer then produces an output. What we do as auditors is we look at the input and the output and we test to see that the input and the output are correct. We don't actually look at what has been done inside the computer. That is the first type of CAT. As mentioned, this is a very primitive type of CAT and is a CAT that is slowly being phased out in South Africa. The next type of CAT is auditing through the computer. Auditing through the computer is where we don't treat the computer as a black box. In fact, we assess the processing of the computer. This means that we test the input, we test the processing, which may mean that we perform IT audits on the system, making sure that the accurate program checks and screen aids are contained on the system. We test the application controls. We attempt to use dummies to test the application controls. That means that we put in fake information into the system and then test to see if that fake information is either detected or processed correctly. With this type of auditing, what we do is we test the input information, we test the processing, and we test the output information. This may include us using dummy input information. Dummy input information means that we create fake information that is not going to affect the client's system. We put it into the system, we look at how the system processes it, and then we look at what the outcome is. In this type of auditing, we receive much better audit evidence because we are testing the entire process. We are testing the input, the processing, the computer processing, as well as the output. The next cat is actually not dealing with the client. This cat is dealing only with the auditor, and it's called auditing with the computer. This simply means that the auditor uses the computer when performing an audit. Now, this happens in the majority of audits in existence today. In fact, there's very few to now no audits that take place without a computer. All it simply means is that we use software and hardware of the computer to store, review, and process audit evidence on the computer. It can also mean that we get rid of what we call a physical audit file and replace it with a soft copy of that audit file. Now let's look at some advantages and disadvantages of auditing around the computer and auditing through the computer. We are not dealing with auditing with the computer because, as mentioned previously, auditing with the computer only deals with the auditor and does not affect the client. More importantly, no one is auditing without a computer in today's world. So there's no need to look at options between the two. But we do have an option between auditing around the computer and auditing through the computer. The first important thing is when we're auditing through the computer, we have a high risk of editing or changing the client's data. This can be averted by creating what we call a mirror site or a dummy site, which means the system is copied onto a separate laptop that is not connected to the rest of the system. We can then play around on that laptop, which means we don't damage or edit the client's software. The next thing is we require a high amount of technical skill, particularly technical programming skills. So the auditor needs to understand how to code and how to program the system to read through the code and identify if there's anything that is wrong or if all the controls are contained in that code. So it requires reading computer code. When auditing through the computer, we may cause disruptions to the client's business. However, when we audit around the computer, there's very little disruptions. But there's a caveat. We can only cause disruptions to the client's business if we do it incorrectly. Through the computer tends to be more expensive because there's a likelihood that we may need to create our own audit software that is particular to our client. So we find that auditing through the computer is generally only used when we are auditing major clients or major banks that are so highly computerized that we are unable to audit it in any other way. We will be able to assess large amounts of data with auditing through the computer, but around the computer does not lend itself to auditing large amounts of data. And the reason for that is because we are checking individual manual inputs and individual manual outputs. We can test for fraud on the system, and this is done by reviewing the coding of the system to ensure that the coding is containing all the accurate controls and that there's nothing wrong with the coding. The independence level of the auditor from the client is lower with auditing through the system because we have created software that we can only use on a given client, which means that we are basically unable to find another client to use the software for. So there's an initial large capital outlay. And because we are on their system, we are more part of the client than we are separated. We are able to use more computer power when it comes to auditing through the system, and we do not need a computer auditor when we're auditing around the computer. So these are the benefits and advantages of both auditing around the computer and auditing through the computer. Now let's move on specifically to the different types of cats. So first we are dealing with different ways of using cats. Now we are dealing with different types of cats. On the left side of your screen in blue, you are going to find all the system-oriented cats. These are cats that are used to audit the system. These are cats generally used when we are dealing with auditing through the computer. These cats would be creating test data. This is where we create fake data or data that is not really the client's data. We put it through the system and see how the system processes it. On specific client systems, we can have it integrated test facility. This is a part of the application that was designed to assist in auditing. Parallel simulations, as mentioned before, is where there's a dummy site. There's only one-way communication. So basically the main site can only input information into the dummy site, but the dummy site cannot input information into the main site. This means that the auditor is able to audit on the dummy site and test and play around with the data without the danger of affecting or damaging the real data that the client is using. Embedded audit facility is where the auditor creates a audit program and then is able to use that audit program for a specific client. So we design the audit program or design the audit software for a specific client and we're unable to use it on other clients. Now on the right side of your screen in gold, you are going to see data-oriented CATs. Data-oriented CATs are mainly used for substantive testing and are mainly used when we are auditing around the computer. Data-oriented CATs, for example, are things like audit software. These are general audit software that is not specialized for a given client, or report writers. This is where we are able to write specific reports or create specific reports based on clients' data. This is very important. Factors that we need to take into account when we want to use CATs. The first is how complex the client system is. If the client system is extremely complex, we are unable to audit around the computer and we are unable to use data-oriented CATs, we are going to have to use both system-oriented CATs and audit through the computer. When we have high volumes of transactions, we will not be able to gain enough audit evidence if we audit around the computer. We want to audit through the computer. If data is stored in electronic format, it becomes desirable to audit through the computer. But it does not mean that it's impossible to audit around the computer. Availability of skills. This is a critical point in South Africa because auditors in South Africa do not have the required programming skills. So we often will be needing specialized programmers to come and assist us. Availability of skills means that the decision between data-oriented CATs and system-oriented CATs becomes a little bit harder, meaning that system-oriented CATs, we will need more IT programmers required, and auditing around the computer becomes more favorable to the auditor because the auditor does not need specific programming skills. Potential for loss of independence. This is another critical point for South Africa because in South Africa we do currently have an independence issue with auditors, or the perception is that auditors are not always independent. However, the truth may be very different. When we use system-oriented CATs and when we audit through the computer, we may lose independence. The attitude of the client towards our system and towards the type of audit software that we use is critically important because without their buy-in and without them being supportive, we will not be able to complete our audit. The compatibility between our system and the client system is also very important because it may require us to create audit software for our specific client. And available utilities or available programs are critically important for us as well. What are the licenses and what are the sourcing of files, copies and printouts that we are able to use when we are auditing. Thank you for tuning in for part 2 of Computer Auditing Advanced. This is the last part in the computer auditing series. So far we have completed 5 videos. I would encourage you to look for other videos on my channel and to stay tuned for more auditing videos. Thank you and bye-bye.